Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the BioCycle's 26th Annual West Coast Conference here in Portland. It's great to be back in Portland. We were last here in 2006, and the city's as wonderful now as it was then, and all the other years before then that we were here. Our first speaker this morning is David Allaway with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And David's been with DEQ as a waste prevention specialist, policy analyst, and I think focusing on energy and greenhouse gas impacts, and I would say probably the resident visionary maybe, or among them. He's going today to sort of set us in the setting of climbing Mount Sustainability. David.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Portland. Thank you, Nora. Nora asked me to speak about DEQ's work to develop a 2050 vision for materials management. This is a project that has sometimes been described as akin to climbing Mount Sustainability. Get my watch here. So let me warn you that I'm going to skewer a couple of proverbial sacred cows today. And in preparation, the good folks at BioCycle have provided ripened tomatoes in the back of the room for your throwing enjoyment. The tomatoes were grown in hothouses in Pennsylvania, heated with 100% domestic, local shale gas. They were flown here to ensure their peak ripeness. However, NANPA, the North American Nightshade Producers Association, certifies that the tomatoes contain lycopene and are 100% compostable and biodegradable, which makes them a healthy and environmentally friendly choice. So this project, Mount Sustainability, the 2050 vision, was really inspired by two factors. First of all, Oregon statute requires that DEQ adopt and periodically update a statewide solid waste management plan. The last plan was adopted in 1994 and expired in 2005. You do not need to be a mathematician to understand that an update is long overdue. At the same time, the world that we're operating in today is quite different from the world that existed when that statute and the plan were both written. We know a lot more now than we did then. And we've been doing integrated solid waste management for about 20 years now. And we're finding that that framework, the framework of discards management, it has some limitations. In the past few years, we've faced a number of challenges where the old adage of reduce, reuse, recycle, compost, recover energy, etc., just hasn't been sufficient. And so we've decided to update the state's solid waste management plan, but to do so in the context of and using the language of a larger and more holistic vision, a vision of materials management for 2050, and key actions to achieve that vision. This visioning project is one that is still underway. I don't even have a draft to share with you today. So technically, we are not climbing Mount Sustainability. We are figuring out where Mount Sustainability is and developing a plan for how to climb it. We are very deep in the middle of the planning process. And in my talk today, I'm going to focus more on our motivation and the process. You'll have to check back later this year for the actual outcomes. So what is this broader materials management framework? EPA defines materials management as referring to the entire life cycle of materials, from raw material extraction to product manufacture, transport, use, and then source reduction, reuse, recycling, and disposal. Materials management considers the entire life cycle of materials, again, from resource extraction all the way through to end of life. It includes, but is not limited to, how we manage our discards, and circled in red is the realm that most of us in this room today operate in. So I want to be very clear that this realm of discards management, where the space that we all work in, that we're all familiar with, is very much a part of this broader materials management framework. Within this broader view of materials management, we are not ignoring the traditional proverbial bread and butter of managing and recovering wastes. Rather, we're taking those issues and placing them in a broader context and taking a broader view. Why? Because materials matter. In the last 50 years, humans, that's those of us in the room and a few billion other people, have consumed more resources than in all of previous history. In 2000, the United States consumed 57% more materials than we did just 25 years earlier. Globally, the rate of increase is even higher. Our economy is very much tied to global markets for these materials, and competition for these materials is increasing. The materials we're using are not only increasing, but they're also changing. In 1900, 41% of the materials used in the US came from renewable sources. By 1995, only 6% of the materials, by mass, used in the United States came from renewable sources. That dependence on non-renewable resources means that our economy is fundamentally not sustainable. And with that dependence comes risks not only to our economy, but even our national security. And that's why the Pentagon has suddenly become very interested in the topic of electronic wastes, because they represent a source of rare earth metals that is otherwise controlled by China. The rapid rise in materials use has led to serious environmental effects as well, which I'm not going to belabor here, most of you know. Let me mention just one of them, global warming. How does materials contribute to global warming? It's a question that was asked by the EPA a few years ago. They took the conventional greenhouse gas inventory for the United States, which is typically reported according to sectors, and instead reassigned the emissions to sources, and found that the production, transport, and end-of-life management of materials contributes 42% of our domestic greenhouse gas emissions. More, much more, than the heating, lighting, cooling of buildings, more than the transportation of people. So materials are very important for a number of reasons, and that's one reason we think it's important to take this broader view. We're also taking a broader view because we're becoming aware of some of the limitations of the traditional view, the view that was created back in the late 1980s when we had a garbage crisis, the view of discards management. Let me mention 3 limits here of this traditional view. First, it seems to us that the traditional focus on discards management really focuses attention on the less impactful part of the life cycle. While materials contribute 42% to our domestic greenhouse gas emissions, end-of-life management contributes only 2%. Most of the emissions are upstream of the consumer, primarily in manufacturing, and the incessant drumbeat of discards management sometimes obscures that. A corollary is that we often end up making decisions that make sense from the view of discards management, but really aren't optimal when viewed holistically. And I could offer many examples of this. In the interest of time, I'm going to share just one, and that is related to compostable plastics, specifically compostable PLA, a plastic resin derived from corn. This will take a couple of minutes, but bear with me. And again, there are some tomatoes in the back. Many of you have probably spent tens, if not hundreds, or maybe thousands of hours discussing compostable plastics. In my experience, 95% of this conversation focuses on their compostability. Do they compost or not? Do they leave fragments of plastics behind? How can we manage these fragments of plastic? How do we get people to sort the plastics? How do we certify that the products will actually not interfere with finished compost quality? Thousands of local governments, food service providers, large and small, and compost facility operators are asking these questions. The questions are important. The underlying assumption, however, seems to be that if the product is compostable, it's a good environmental choice, and if the product isn't compostable, it isn't. In other words, the framework that most people are using to view this question is very much a framework of discards management. And what is often missing from the discussion is a broader life cycle view. Now, DEQ recently completed a life cycle analysis of 48 different methods of delivering drinking water. And here let me show you a few examples from just 3 of those 48 methods. In brown, we have water in a single-use bottle made from PLA, where all the bottles are disposed of in Oregon, which means most of them go to landfill. In green, we have the same bottles, but explore what happens if about 62% of them are diverted to commercial compost sites. And in blue, we have the competing single-use bottle made from conventional PET, derived from natural gas or petroleum, again, recycled at a rate of 62%. This slide is showing ecotoxicity potential, the release of pollutants that have toxicity impacts specific to non-human life. Darker colors on this slide are impacts that occur upstream of the consumer. The lighter shades of colors represent impacts that occur downstream in discards management. So you can see here that the compostable PLA bottle is a better environmental choice in this metric, due entirely to differences upstream in production, not because it is compostable and not because it is composted. In fact, composting versus landfilling this bottle makes essentially no difference. When PLA degrades in a compost pile, our understanding is that it degrades to carbon dioxide and water. It doesn't produce compost. It does nothing to contribute to the value of compost or composting. It does not enhance soil fertility or tilth. It does not conserve water. It does not displace fertilizers. In fact, rather than calling this zero waste, I would say that composting PLA is a total waste. Because all of the resources, all of the embodied energy, all of the molecular structure is totally and irrevocably wasted when you put it in a compost pile. Not true if you were to recycle it, but that's not what we're showing here. Here's a different impact category, and that's eutrophication. This includes the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, partially a result of runoff from Midwestern corn farming. Here, compostable PLA is a worse choice, but again, that has nothing to do with its compostability or its composting. And what about global warming? Well, we don't know if PLA degrades in a landfill or not. If it does, and it produces methane, then composting is a better choice than landfilling. But PLA is still worse than PET. And if that PLA bottle is inert in a landfill, if it doesn't degrade, and so the landfill ends up storing the biogenic carbon, which was removed from the atmosphere via photosynthesis, then the compostable PLA bottle is a better choice, but only if you don't compost it. The point of this illustration is not to pick on PLA, but rather to show what's missing when our society focuses just on discards management, and how we end up making decisions that can be penny-wise but pound-foolish. A final limitation of the discards management perspective is that, frankly, we believe it offers potential but limited potential for environmental improvements. You've seen this pie chart before. These are domestic greenhouse gas emissions. What if we could achieve the nirvana of zero waste? What if we could recycle or compost 95% of all municipal solid waste? The benefits would be great. We would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts by a very large amount. In the case of greenhouse gas emissions, about 6% of total domestic emissions. That's great, but it leaves the lion's share of materials-related impacts untouched. And frankly, we don't need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 6%. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% or more. And so to do that, discards management has to be part of a larger package. So what would sustainable materials management look like? We don't know. We've reviewed 6 different frameworks shown here, and we found that they all have some advantages, and yet they all have some limitations. For example, William McDonough and Michael Braungart's book, Cradle to Gradle, has been deeply influential in the design and environmental communities. It describes a state of sustainability where all products are maintained in perpetual cycles, either as technical nutrients or as biological nutrients that can be recycled in perpetuity. In this world of cradle to cradle, we take nothing from nature and we produce no wastes. So there is no need for limits or constraints, and we can celebrate nature's fecundity and consume with abandon. What a very inspiring vision that is so different from the hair shirt environmentalism of use less stuff that we've been beaten into. Unfortunately, this vision violates the second law of thermodynamics. And although there's crazy things going on in Washington, D.C., they haven't figured out how to repeal that yet. Even the Supreme Court hasn't been able to do it. This vision of cradle to cradle also emphasizes the beginning and the end of the life cycle and gives short shrift to the middle. So for example, McDonough and Braungart were asked to design a new upholstery fabric. And so they said, we made it clear to our client that our intention was to create a product that would enter either the biological or technical metabolism. The team decided to design a fabric that would be safe enough to eat. It would not harm people who breathed it in, and it would not harm natural systems after its disposal. In fact, as a biological nutrient, it would nourish nature. So they decided to develop this fabric that's a blend of wool and ramie. They go on to say, as a biological nutrient, the fabric embodied the kind of fecundity we find in nature's work. After customers finished using it, they could simply tear the fabric off of their chair frame. I want each of you to practice this right now. Tear the fabric off of their chair frame and throw it onto the soil or compost heap without feeling bad, even perhaps with a kind of relish. Throwing something away can be fun, let's admit it. And giving a guilt-free gift to nature is an incomparable pleasure. So that's cradle to cradle. It is the act of composting as the absolution of guilt and responsibility. And while we're celebrating throwing our cradle to cradle upholstery in the compost heap, I have to wonder who's not going to be eating because of all the cropland that's going to be devoted to producing the ramie, and also the wool. If you think we have a methane problem now, do you think more wool is going to help? So we have a white paper that explores these 6 topics. I think you might find it thought-provoking. It's shown there on the slide. Early in our project, we found inspiration, as we were struggling with this definition of Mount Sustainability, we found inspiration in the words of Ray Anderson, the former CEO of Interface Carpet. He described his company's struggle, similar to ours, to figure out what is sustainability and how do we get there. He used the analogy of Mount Sustainability. There, Mount Sustainability, a mountain that no one has climbed yet. There are multiple climbing routes. They haven't even been explored. Some of these routes may end up being dead ends. We don't know. We don't know all the equipment we're going to need. We don't know how long it's going to take, how many attempts, how many camps, etc. But before we start debating which route to climb, we'd better know where Mount Sustainability is. We might debate going up the left side over there, or we might debate going up the right side, and anyway, we might eventually reach the summit, only to discover that that isn't Mount Sustainability. Mount Sustainability is over here. So we need a clear vision of where we're trying to get to. Our project is defining a vision and some action steps to achieve it. The vision is a vision for 2050, which might strike you as a long ways out. It is, but we found it liberating to not be entirely constrained by existing and short-term limits. In contrast, the action steps that we're discussing are focused on the short and intermediate term, no more than 15 years out. Again, we don't know all the steps that will be required to summit, particularly further out, but some of the actions we can take now will help to lay the foundation for that harder climb at the end. This process is referred to as backcasting. It involves starting with an understanding of where we are now, leapfrogging forward to where we eventually want to be, and then working backwards to figure out how to get there. This is different from many plans, which are developed using forecasting. In forecasting, you say, we're down here in the foothills, and we want to go up. So let's just start walking uphill, and eventually we're going to end up somewhere better than we are now. It will be less bad than we are now. Backcasting, in contrast, starts by saying, okay, where is the summit on this mountain anyways? Where is it we're trying to get to? And with a clear understanding of that, then figuring out how to get there. It may seem sort of obvious, but it's amazing how many plans don't use that approach. So we're thick in the middle of this project right now. We've completed 4 day-long meetings with a number of external stakeholders. Some of you are in this room. Thank you very much. We have our final meeting with them next month. From there, we'll have a complete first draft of the vision and action items, which we'll share with the public during the summer. Our goal is to get this to our Environmental Quality Commission in October. Now, one of the outcomes already is that in preparing for our stakeholder meetings, we've conducted some interesting, and I think in some cases, some groundbreaking research and analysis. There's a long series of background papers on our website. Don't be intimidated by this list. Most of these papers are actually quite short. Let me mention a couple of them. Because we're taking a life cycle materials management view, this project is not limited just to actions at end of life. So there are a series of papers that explore the topics of sustainable production and sustainable consumption, both very fertile ground for new work. In the traditional arena of discards management, we've done some analysis of waste generation and some, I think, interesting analysis of the energy conservation and greenhouse gas reduction potential associated with the recovery of different waste streams to help us identify which waste streams should we be focusing on managing better. Food is high on the list. So our draft vision is available in a draft form and has already gone through one round of public review. I won't read it here again in the interest of time, but you can find it online. The vision is supported by a framework for action, and the framework divides the life cycle of materials management into three basic elements. The first, called upstream or design and production, everything upstream of the consumer, shown in green. The second element dealing with consumption, and the third dealing with end of life. Each one of these elements has a parallel structure, beginning with a description of existing conditions, moving on to desired outcomes for the year 2050, and then landing on some short and intermediate term actions that DEQ could take to help realize those outcomes and the larger vision. We're also working on a foundational element that describes guiding principles, systems and capabilities, and some foundational key actions that address such topics as funding, goals, and evaluation. There are a few other states that have developed what they call materials management plans, but they do seem to focus very much, if not exclusively, on managing discards. Our project in Oregon feels very different in that it is addressing discards management, but also the rest of the life cycle. Having said that, let me close here because most of you work in the world of discards management with just a flavor of some of the issues that we've been exploring with our work group. Again, mostly specific to end-of-life management. Again, we're very much in the thick of this, but for example, we're interested in pursuing the idea of highest and best use. That materials at end of life, actually not only at end of life, but specifically at end of life, should go to their highest and best use. So how do you define that? How do you reconcile, for example, the apparent conflict between composting and energy recovery? And does the state need new authority to get those materials to their highest and best use in cases where the market is failing to do so? We've had some discussion about whether or not disposal and also recovery prices should reflect their full environmental and social costs. And if so, how would that be achieved? There's a number of different policy mechanisms that could be applied, none of them easy or free of controversy. Oregon does ban some materials from disposal. Should we expand on that list? For example, food waste, taking a page from the European Union. And if we do so, will that cause the infrastructure to get built out? Are there other materials that should be banned from disposal? Are there any new mandates that should be required? Oregon has a lot of requirements of its local governments regarding the provision of services. Should those requirements be built upon? Moving a little bit upstream, we've had a little conversation about how recovery systems may or may not drive consumers in support of deeper, more sustainable behaviors. So for example, how do we design recycling and composting programs so that the programs serve as an on-ramp to deeper sustainability behaviors, as opposed to a cul-de-sac where people say, okay, I'm composting, I'm recycling, I've done my part. I don't need to engage in changes in what I'm buying or how I'm using materials. The evidence on this is very fuzzy. There's been some research that says composting and recycling is like a gateway drug to prevention. And then there's some other research that said, no, it's a dead end. It actually gets in the way It keeps people from engaging in these deeper behaviors, and that's a topic that needs more exploration. And finally, how should we measure all of this? We've always done a recovery rate. Should we use some different performance metrics? Maybe do what Scotland has done and use a greenhouse gas-based metric for measuring the success of our end-of-life management systems. So anyways, we intend to make a complete draft of the vision and actions available for review in June. We're charting a lot of new ground here. We want to make sure we do this well. So we very much want your critical review this summer if you're willing to offer it. You can follow the project via the project webpage. You can send me a note. Also, there's a couple of people here in the room from DEQ. Bob, Loretta, are you here? Anyone else working on the project team? Loretta, if you could stand up, and Bob Barrows, also in the back there. And Jessica Branham-Zwick, are you here from Cascadia? She's registered for the conference. Cascadia Consulting is working with us on this project as well. So talk with one of them during the conference if you'd like. That's it for sort of where we are now. Thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing the discussion with you. Thank you.